Anyway, so I have a lot of materials that were, pulled out of libraries that were obviously out of print, but well, Minix, I think you should do hospital association. Oh, I don't think so. But he's a Minix professor.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an Elena and Miles Zaremski Law Medicine Forum. Elena and Miles Zaremski is a 1973 graduate of the law school and is a health law practitioner in Chicago. He and his wife Elena have generously endowed this speakers program. We bring speakers to the law school at noon and to discuss issues of major interest and importance in the areas of healthcare and health law. And today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Nida Degesys, who is the national president of AMSA, the American Medical Student Association, and has just completed medical school at the Northeast Ohio Medical University. Before that, she graduated summa cum laude from Ohio University and then served in the Peace Corps. She's done and presented research on patient safety, disability issues, and medical education. And she is about to leave Northeastern Ohio for the Bay Area to take up a residency in emergency medicine at UCSF. We're very fortunate that before she leaves, she will spend this time with us and discuss an academic conflict, pharma's increasing influence on medical education. Following her formal remarks, we'll have time for Q&A, but since this session is being webcast, we ask that you use the microphones if you have questions, and we will probably be able to move the microphones around to you so you don't have to get up and come down. But please do remember to speak into the microphone when you have a question. So without more, please welcome Dr. Degesys.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Melman, so much for that nice introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Nida Degesys. I'm not only a physician, but the national president of the American Medical Student Association, AMSA. AMSA is the largest independent student-run, student-governed organization of physicians in training. We have over 40,000 members in our association, and so I have the privilege of representing them for an entire year. I actually live in the DC area. You're required to take a year off, but from clinical training in order to work for the organization. Something that we're very proud of as an organization is the work that we do on things like medical education, student debt, advocacy. And one of our biggest topics that we have been working on is conflict of interest in medical education. And because we are a completely independent run organization, we are not a child organization of, for example, the AMA, we are able to lobby on the Hill, and so I've been able to spend a lot of time lobbying on the Hill on issues of great importance, but additionally testifying, for example, at FDA hearings or at trade meetings when we talk about global trade agreements. And so AMSA is very proud of that history, and so that's a little bit about me and a little bit about AMSA. So I'm curious today, I see that we have different audience members. I'm curious how many students are in attendance, with a show of hands. And are you all law students? Any medical law students, like MD, JDs? No. Okay, but all of you are interested in health law, I'm assuming, of some sort. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here. Okay, and everybody else, health law practitioners? Great. Great. So a nice mix, and I asked that in order to kind of explain where I'm coming from, but also why this is important to everybody, regardless of what you are practicing in. Before we get started, I want to tell a story of why the topic of conflict of interest is so important. And in April 2003, Dr. David Cox, a 42-year-old family medicine practitioner, was teaching a family medicine resident in his office when he developed a terrible headache. Now, Dr. Cox was very healthy, 42, avid exerciser, never smoked, did not have high cholesterol, did not have diabetes, no family history of strokes, heart attacks, or any cardiovascular issues. Really was just assuming that he had a brain aneurysm, that type of very, very quick onset of a headache. He went to the hospital, they performed an MRI, and they found that Dr. Cox had suffered from a stroke, and strokes are caused by blood clots. And these types of blood clots don't typically occur in healthy 42-year-olds. They occur in older patients, patients with significant risk factors like smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And he didn't have any of those. And so he was really thinking about what could have caused this stroke. The stroke left him partially paralyzed. He was no longer able to practice medicine. And they were really trying to figure out what had happened. What was found out was that Dr. Cox was actually prescribed by his own physician, Vioxx. Who knows or remembers the case about Vioxx a few years ago? Vioxx is an anti-inflammatory medication that was approved by the FDA in 1999, specifically for things like arthritis. And so that is actually what Dr. Cox was prescribed the medication for. Now, while it was approved in 1999, Merck, the company that actually produced Vioxx, knew from internal documents, we know this, knew that Vioxx actually had huge increased risks of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes. Yet, they didn't tell the FDA until 2002 and did not pull the medication off the shelves until 2004. And so Dr. Cox was taking this medication based on evidence that was provided to his practitioners, evidence based on wrong information, information that was misleading and did not include all of the correct information, including huge risk of death, stroke, heart attack. I'm sure that had Dr. Cox known this, he would not have been taking this for his arthritis when he could have taken something much simpler that was already proven to be much safer, something like an ibuprofen or an naproxen. To add insult to injury, Vioxx, there was a very large lawsuit against Merck on Vioxx that resulted in a $4.85 billion, that's billion with a B, dollar settlement against Merck. However, Dr. Cox was actually unable to participate in the litigation against Merck because he lived in the state of Michigan. And Michigan had a law in 1996 that forbade suing pharmaceutical companies on drugs that had FDA approval. And so he was actually not able to sue Vioxx and Merck along with the other 20,000+ individuals. And I bring this up because this medication in particular was one of the highest prescribed medications in the country, and really and truly had, I think about a Lancet Journal article mentioned that Vioxx had 88,000 individuals who had suffered from a cardiovascular event, and of those 88,000, 38,000 of them died. That is a lot of individuals, and they had the information. So what I'd like to mention, before now I move on to the formal presentation, is I personally would like to say that I do not have any financial disclosures as we're talking about conflict of interest in medical education. I do not have any conflicts to disclose in terms of financial entities with healthcare-related projects or services. However, part of my work with the American Medical Student Association is derived from a grant from the State Attorney General's Consumer and Prescriber Education Grant Program, which is funded through several states from a Pfizer settlement on Neurontin. And Pfizer was required to pay approximately $430 million for this illegal marketing practices. And our organization, AMSA, along with several other organizations, were provided some funding in terms of working on conflict of interest. So where we'll be going today is I'll talk a little bit about the current state of the relationship between medical education, educators, physicians, and the industry. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's currently being done on these issues, and then what still needs to be done. And I hope to leave enough time for questions and answers. Who here has their own physician? Who has a physician? I hope all of you. Most of you, a vast majority have a physician. Well, likelihood is your physician has some sort of relationship with industry. Studies show that over 94%, that's virtually every single physician, has some sort of tie with the industry. And this has caused such concerns over the last few decades that the Institute of Medicine issued a report in 2009 that really detailed these specific concerns with physicians and their conflicts. Now, what types of conflicts am I talking about, and how are these relationships formed? So the industry that I talk about, specifically pharmaceutical industry, spends over $27 billion a year on marketing. And of that, contrary to popular belief, everybody thinks it's direct-to-consumer marketing because we see the Viagra, Cialis, Prozac ads on TV all the time, but actually that is not correct. 24 billion of the 27 billion is spent on physician marketing, not direct to consumer. Only 3 billion is on direct to consumer marketing, which I find to be very interesting. So I want to show you a quick clip. If we can get technology to work for me. And you might be familiar with some of these direct-to-consumer ads.
Thoughts keep you awake. Sleep is here on the wings of Lunesta. And if you wake up often in the middle of the night, rest is here on the wings of Lunesta.
It's like I can't participate in life. I'm too busy worrying. I don't sleep at night. I'm thinking about my friends and thinking about my family.
Your worst fears, the what ifs, and I can't control it, and I'm always worrying about it.
So no, I don't tell people about. Do you get cold when it's chilly? Hungry if you don't eat? I know I sure do. Until recently, I thought I was perfectly healthy. That's when my doctor told me about pretenditrin.
So I bring this last one up for the obvious joke, because obviously we know that that one was fake, but how many of you were tricked into thinking at first that was actually a real advertisement? I sure was when I watched it. You can see that marketers are very, very clever in how they direct to consumer, but they're also very clever in the way that they market to physicians. And so I want to go a little bit into detail on some things in terms of finance. And so what I'm often told by members of the press or by other physicians or specifically by industry representatives is that the research and development of new drugs is costly. And that's why they need to spend $27 billion to market, because they need to recoup those costs. Well, I am here to tell you that that's actually quite a bit of BS. Yes, it is true that research and development is costly. However, studies have shown, and even as recently as just last year, a British medical journal article found that for every single dollar spent on research and development, $19, that's $19 to everyone is spent on promotion and marketing. So it's not just to recuperate costs. This is a profit-generating industry, and I don't blame them. They're a business. That's what they're there to do. So what types of direct to physicians what types of relationships am I talking about? So of that $24 billion, a lot of it is spent on what's called detailing. Detailing is what's considered that face-to-face interaction with pharmaceutical representatives. That's actually what most physicians are most used to seeing in their offices. They bring samples, they're very friendly, and we found that there's approximately 72,000, give or take, pharmaceutical reps every single year. Now, when you look at the number of physicians, that's pretty much a one pharmaceutical rep for every 3 physicians. That's a lot of pharmaceutical reps who have a lot of time to dedicate to one specific physician, or in their case, 3 physicians. And it's resulted in a lot of spending on per physician, approximately $12,000 to $13,000 per year on this detailing. And they're very, very good at this. I don't know if anyone saw a film, a few years old, Love and Other Drugs. A famous actor, Jake Gyllenhaal, was in it. He's a pharmaceutical representative. And it's actually quite good in terms of a film, but also shows how pharmaceutical representatives are trained. They're trained to influence physicians. There's a reason that they know exactly what to say. There's a reason they know how to ask about your family. There's a reason that they look so nice and smile and remember your birthday, send baskets. There are scripts on this, and a very interesting Wall Street Journal piece, as well as a article written by Dr. Bergman, showed exactly what that script said, and it gave an insight to those of us who are not in the pharmaceutical industry just how that script is followed. It's very prescriptive and very interesting if you have time to take a look at that. Other ways that they do this: lunch. Bring food. If you feed them, they will come. Oftentimes that happens. Students in particular, as a student, when I was a medical student, if it had free lunch, you better believe I was there. Free dinner, I was there. Luckily, my university did not accept pharmaceutical-sponsored lunches, but if it is pharmaceutical-sponsored, it doesn't make a big difference for medical students. So that's another huge cost of that $24 billion. Other forms, so those are the direct forms. And then there are something a little bit more concerning and not always considered when we're talking about conflict of interest, is the indirect marketing. Continuing medical education, which is CME, similar to CLE, which I'm sure many of you are here for today, is sponsored oftentimes by pharmaceutical industries. In 2011, 32% was sponsored, and now it's gotten a little bit better in terms of the number of 27% of all CME credits sponsored by industry. Now, industry is smart. They know why to do this, because when the studies have again showed that when they put in $1 invested in continuing medical education credits, they receive $3.56 in revenue generation. That's not bad returns. What I think is a little bit trickier, and I think a little bit more concerning, is how much money is being provided to external non-medical groups, specifically patient advocacy groups and other health groups. Funding provided to them has been shown for those then organizations to, no surprise, to endorse that specific pharmaceutical product. What's even trickier is a lot of those health advocacy or patient advocacy or other organizations also provide funding for CME. So while that 27% looks like it's becoming less and less, that money, that 27% is specifically if Pfizer were to write a check for CME. But it does not include if, let's say, another organization like MEC, which receives 80% of their funding from pharmaceutical, provides a $10,000 grant for my CME. So we're not really sure if those numbers are changing or not, but it is very concerning that additional organizations can also provide money for funding for continuing medical education. I ask a question to my students very frequently, and to practitioners as well, of what they think, if they think that they're being influenced. And so I want to do something similar with you all as well. So by a show of hands, no one will take it offensively, no one will look left or right to see if you feel that you are personally influenced, but how many of you think that you would be personally influenced by face-to-face time with a pharmaceutical rep? By a show of hands. Okay. How many of you think that your colleague or your physician would be influenced? Okay. So what I did notice, and what we noticed time and time again, is something very similar to the results that an American Journal of Medicine published. That when we think about ourselves, we perceive ourselves to be invulnerable. In fact, 61% of the time, we think that we have no bias at all, that we are not at all influenced. We know better. But when we ask the same question of our friend next door, our colleague next door, oh, they have a problem. They have highly problematic influence from pharmaceutical reps. So the problem is never me, it's you. So again, we actually, when you all raised your hands, while more of you than 61% said none, said that you were influenced, many of you did say you were influenced, but almost everybody's hand was up when we thought somebody else might have an issue. And that's very, very common. We have nice relationships with pharmaceutical representatives. We have these great experiences with them. And so when we look at the studies about how our attitudes are towards them, they're very positive. And it doesn't matter what specialty. This could be surgical specialty, family medicine, psychiatry. The studies have shown across all specialties, we have these positive experiences. What about med students? So I'm talking about physicians, but who cares about medical students? They don't prescribe, so why would they ever even come and see a pharmaceutical representative? Well, they started looking at this actually very recently. In 2005, the very first study on this found that medical students, and they were just looking at 1,500 medical students, 8 different universities, 93% of the students were required to attend industry-sponsored activities. 80% of them, which I find very troubling, felt they were entitled to pharmaceutical gifts in terms of lunches, pens, papers, textbooks. And so was this an isolated incident? And so now we've done much larger studies. A very large study with over 9,800 students at 76 different schools of medicine found very similar, very startling results. And this was just 2 years ago. Very frequent industry interactions with students. Students are feeling actually, or no surprise, the more and more they interact with a pharmaceutical industry individual, the less biased they think the information is. Upwards, because it was a meta-analysis, they found somewhere between 90 to 100% of the students had some form of industry meal that year, and 90% had educational materials provided. Now, from a medical student perspective, we, with medical student debt being over $170,000 on average, you can see why medical students would accept these things. Lunch can be expensive. Textbooks are very expensive in medical and in law school. These books cost money. So somebody giving you a large textbook could actually be a significant chunk of change. And students are thinking it's completely ethical to receive these gifts. Yet, when you ask them if they think it would be acceptable for a governmental official to accept the same gifts, no, that would be completely unacceptable. So again, there's this feeling of, well, physicians and medical students, we are exempt from all of this, but everybody else has to follow the rules. So what I'm getting to is, are we immune? Now, I think there's been enough social science literature to suggest over and over again that no, we are absolutely not immune to pharmaceutical and or interactions with industry. And some of the very interesting, I think, and pretty surprising results show that even less than a minute, which is very, very short, less than a minute with a sales rep, your prescribing changes by 16%. 3 minutes, again, 3 minutes is nothing. 52% prescribing change. If this doesn't show us that we really are being influenced, then I don't know what does. Specifically to lunches, there have been several studies on whether or not lunches can actually change your prescribing behavior. And they looked at 2 different drugs, and after a CME-sponsored lunch, all of the drugs that were talked about had increased prescription rates. This is something that is happening over and over again, changing prescription rates. And why is this bad? It's not bad because the medication works. Obviously, if medications work, you want people to prescribe them. The reason this is a problem is they are prescribing this medication based on a sales pitch without really looking at the evidence. And I will also talk about in a little bit on why the evidence might actually be flawed evidence and why we can't be using industry-sponsored research to solely make our decisions. So why do we do these things? I have people tell me all the time many different things, and these are the top, I think, 4 reasons that I hear from providers. Why are they interacting with industry? We know all of these studies. These studies have been going on for decades, actually. Since the 90s, we've been looking at social science behavior. So why are we doing it? Well, the reason that I've been hearing is that I'm learning a lot from our reps. They're smart, they know the drug, they're able to educate me. It's wonderful. I've heard, and this is a very common one, and I understand it, that time is money. Physicians don't have a lot of time. Their time is valuable. And so to have a lunch at the same time they're having a meeting is efficient. That way they don't have to try to get lunch at another time that day and they can instead see a patient. Residents and medical students, I'm poor. That's a very, very common one. And the one that I find to be very distressing that I come across a lot is how samples and the samples that pharmaceutical representatives bring help their underinsured patients. And an anecdote about that, I was interviewing for medical school six years ago in Boston, and my interviewer was appalled at my conflict of interest stance and was appalled that I was actually there for a protest at their university on their conflict of interest policies. And she was just basically her words were, "You are naive, you will figure it out someday, my samples help my insured patients, how dare you?" What I wish I would have told her, had I had the gall or the ability to say, is that, well, perhaps she thinks that samples are helping her underinsured patients. But the truth is that only 28% of all samples that are distributed go to underinsured patients. That means the vast majority are going to those who have insurance. So we are not actually helping the under and uninsured. In fact, we're increasing overall cost of patient care because now you've prescribed you've given a sample that now you've written a prescription for, and your patient is now going to only go fill that brand name medication. So that's going to increase out of costs for patients, which increases patient costs overall. Additionally, we find that when we are in a practice that has samples, residents who are in that practice are less likely to prescribe generic medications. You remove all the samples, guess what skyrockets? Prescriptions for generics. So again, those samples are not so innocuous. They actually are doing things. So what's the truth? Why are we really doing it? So I told you what they say. So what's the real truth? The real truth is, based on social science studies, that sense of invulnerability that I mentioned, but there's also a sense of entitlement. And that entitlement we rationalize as time is valuable. We deserve fancy CME lunches in these beautiful hotel ballrooms. And part of the reason that people are saying this is, again, it is very costly to take that kind of time out from patient care. In a legal perspective, you're losing billable hours. So you can see how that rationalization would occur. So what's more concerning to me, not just this interaction face-to-face, I think what's more difficult for me to comprehend and to really wrap my brain around is the conflicts that exist within research and industry and research. So I'm curious for you all, what do you think? What do you think some of the conflicts could be with industry-sponsored research? Yes?
They wouldn't reveal side effects, kind of like when lawyers will talk to their clients in front of court. They won't tell the judge the negatives about their case, but maybe privately, they'll tell the client, well, you can get 5 flaws to your case, there's no such thing as a perfect case, but they won't tell that to the judge.
Right. So to repeat for the webcast, that negative or adverse events won't be fully disclosed, because as lawyers often, as the gentleman mentioned, won't always disclose the negative sides of a case to a judge because that doesn't help their interests. How else could industry-sponsored research be full of conflict or biased? Yes?
The studies would be designed to promote or prove a drug that a new or its lower patent is still effective.
Yes, very good. So study design would be completely different from an industry design study whose goal is to get a drug either approved or onto shelves faster versus perhaps a publicly funded. So those are two very good examples of how industry can bias research. So a majority, and this should actually be very concerning to you all out there as consumers of healthcare, that a majority of clinical research is actually funded by the industry. And again, what's happening is there are reporting discrepancies. There was a major meta-analysis done that looked at the reporting discrepancies between industry-funded research versus government or publicly funded research. And they found that they are not reporting the same things. Lo and behold, serious side effects aren't as frequently reported in industry-funded. The study designs are very different in industry exams, and they're not equal. No surprise that in both in a JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the British Medical Journal found that you are more likely, an industry-funded research project is 4 to 6 times more likely to have positive results than if it is a non-industry funded. That's a really big discrepancy, one that cannot be attributed to statistics. I think the gentleman, somebody had mentioned suppression of adverse events, and I think that's actually very, 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 very concerning, and there have been some things done so that that's not occurring. One example that I found to be very distressing, GlaxoSmithKline, a very well-known pharmaceutical company, made an antidepressant, paroxetine. And paroxetine was known, and this has been found, the Canadian Medical Journal printed this, published on this a few years ago, found that the pharmaceutical company GSK knew how harmful that antidepressant was to children, to adolescents, but they suppressed that information because, and I quote, because it is unacceptable, and that this information would, quote, undermine the profile of paroxetine, unquote. These are their own internal documents. And how many children have now suffered, adolescents that we've heard about in the news, from antidepressants? So yes, disproportionate favorable results, suppression of adverse events. But even more concerning to me is this concept of ghostwriting. Ghostwriting is when somebody who is not listed as the primary author is actually the true author. Ghostwriters tend to be employees of the pharmaceutical industry. They're staff members, and typically they're not even written in the acknowledgement section. And they're finding that over 20% of all published articles are written by ghostwriters. This is a huge problem. They place the name of some well-known researcher from a very well-known medical institution as the first author, and that author had very little to do with the actual writing and probably had nothing to do with the actual study design itself. And that is highly concerning. Remember the Vioxx case that I mentioned with Dr. Cox? That study was written by ghostwriters, and they have found this. Again, this all came out during the litigation, was found how perverse this was and what that was happening. And there are, and I have just listed here, and I'm not going to go through these, but this is just a handful, truly just a handful of research articles on ghostwriting and how pervasive this is in medical education. So obviously, editors of journals are up in arms. two very famous journals, the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association, their editors have written on ghostwriting and just how broken this system of industry-funded research is and how biased it is. And when editors are writing things like that, we should really be taking note. They're publishing this data, so they see it all the time on a daily basis. If they're saying there's a flaw, there's a flaw. So this type of conflict goes both directions. When we look at academic medical centers, or AMCs, and you look at department heads, presidents, boards of trustees, people high level who are supposed to be looking after an institution, they also have conflicts. And what we found, actually, this literally not less than 2 weeks ago, on April 2nd, this was published in JAMA, that 40% of pharmaceutical companies have at least one academic medical center administrator on their board at the same time that that individual is working for the academic medical center. Now, boards of trustees have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. So how can they, at the same time, be a fiduciary to a company who has shareholders and still be able to be an unbiased individual overseeing medical education? They can't. That would be nearly impossible to do. So there's this huge pervasive problem that's not just in research, not just in the office, but even in our academic medical centers where the future physicians are being trained. So people say, how is this possible? Once the FDA knows about it, someone's going to do something about it. So what is the FDA? What is it? I mean, simplistically, like, what is it? Food and Drug Administration. And what does it do? Students of law. What does the FDA do? It regulates. What does it regulate? Food and drugs. It's pretty much out there in the letters, FDA. It is the regulating body that makes sure that the drugs that we are consuming, the food that we are consuming, things that we are consuming are safe and are effective. Right? That's the FDA's job. The FDA is the gold standard that we learn about in school. The FDA is, when they approve something, that means it was a rigorous test. That means it is safe, for the most part, might have a label, but that means it's safe enough to take, that the benefits outweigh the risks. Their mission on the FDA website is really to protect the public health. Yet, we're finding a lot of alarming problems with the FDA. The FDA actually, just very recently, in 2012, passed some legislation, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, that actually removed the cap, meaning now they don't have this cap, of the percentage of individuals on their advisory councils who have conflict of interests. That means more people with conflicts can serve on the FDA. That does not sound to me, nor does it sound to many other researchers, that this is good for the integrity of MedEd or the integrity of research. In fact, this is really causing a lot of concern for the potential for increased bias in the approval process. And I can give you some examples because I've actually been testifying at the FDA. There's this panic about the superbugs. Have you heard about superbugs? MRSA, MRSA, ooh, it's gonna kill you. So I'm not here to say MRSA is not bad. MRSA is terrible. I wouldn't want to have it. It is a bad drug. It is a bad bug. It's difficult to kill. The FDA has already approved over 15 different medications to treat MRSA. The problem is there's no money in antibiotics. And so pharmaceutical industries, obviously a business, don't want to be in a market that's not very lucrative for them. And so what's happened is actually the lobby, the pharma lobby is actually very, 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 very strong, has been able to pass legislation on fast-tracking antibiotics because of these scary superbugs. And they do that by having smaller, part of fast tracking is you don't need as large of a sample size to do a study. You can use something called a non-inferiority trial. And non-inferiority trials are very, 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 very concerning because they, basically what you're saying is a new drug that you are testing, you compare it to an old drug that has been shown to be somewhat effective. And all you have to show is that it's not worse than 10% worse than that current medication. Again, all you have to show is it's not worse than what's currently out there. How is this better for our patients? that it's not worse. And in fact, since these non-inferiority trials are shorter, you don't actually know the adverse events. And so a very, very famous example that's just been coming up is tigecycline, was passed through these non-inferiority fast-tracking antibiotics for MRSA. And what we found was it looked like it was just as good as some of the tetracyclines against this superbug, but lo and behold, it had almost twice the death rate. That is horrible, and yet that was approved. And only recently has there now been a warning label that says, "Whoa, let's hold up here. Tigecycline actually is very harmful," because they didn't know that because they were only studying it for 30-some days or a very short period of time, not long-term effects. And so that's just one example. Other legislation that was just recently passed, the GAIN Act, which is generating antibiotic incentives now, was signed into law by the president as part of this FDA Safety Innovation Act that extends exclusivity period for pharmaceutical companies for those antibiotics by 5 years. That means they have complete market exclusivity for 5 years. Again, that was to try to promote this innovation for these superbugs. But again, what's happening is based on those acts, we are approving drugs. Just last week, I was testifying at the FDA on 2 skin drugs, Tedezolid and danvavansin, specifically based on the fact that they are non-inferiority trials and they didn't show that they were better, and actually they didn't even study the drug on the actual superbug that they need to actually treat, the superbug that actually kills people, which is the vancomycin-resistant bacteria. They didn't study that because you can't include those people in your trials. So this is a huge problem, and it's being pushed through because everyone's concerned about safety, which I am as well. Another legislation that was proposed in the House, HR 3742, the ADAPT Act, which is the Antibiotic Development to Advance Patient Treatment, is a very similar issue. And while not yet law, the problem with this is you need even less numbers of people in your trials in order to qualify for this. Now, people will say, well, Nida, if somebody is dying, shouldn't they get this medication if vancomycin or another drug is not working? Well, the FDA does have compassionate use clauses. There are exceptions to use medications when all else fails. There is that. Compassionate care or expanded use does exist. So we already have that in place. I think people have been asking about that a lot, especially in light of the recent Dallas Buyers Club film that won a lot of awards that talked about all these HIV/AIDS patients dying because they didn't have access to the medication. Well, there is a clause for compassionate use. The FDA advisory committees are also having some serious issues with conflict. Katie Anderson, the woman in the slide, at 16 took a very famous drug, Yaz, and Yasmin, which is an oral contraceptive pill, because she had heard from a commercial that it was good for her acne, which, by the way, it was not actually approved for acne. They had to go out and give another commercial that said, the FDA wants us to redact this commercial, and we're not really treating acne. The problem is the drug, the Bayer drug, the Yaz drug, was approved. It was found to have significant problems in terms of clots in the legs, deep venous thromboses, which can move to the lungs and cause you to stop breathing and actually is very life-threatening. And the FDA actually, through internal documents, and we know this because the former FDA commissioner, David Kessler, has actually come out and said, actually, we did know that this was a problem. We did know that there was a 6 times more likelihood to get a clot in your leg from this drug versus other oral contraceptives. But it was approved, and perhaps it was approved because 4 of the panelists on the advisory committee worked for Bayer. 4. That's not a few, especially when the votes were actually very close on whether or not this was going to be approved. It was approved 15 to 11. So that would have made 4 votes would have made a big difference. And so these things are happening time and time again, and it's not just within, I have to say, when I was testifying, I was again overwhelmed by the fact that it's not just who sits on the panel, but the speakers. All these speakers also were brought, and more than 50% of the speakers were travel was paid for by that pharmaceutical company. So the company of Tedezolid actually paid for a patient to come down, paid for a doctor from Florida to come up and speak as an open testimony, and they actually had the nerve to say, well, we don't really have any conflicts other than they paid for our travel and our hotel. But I'm here on my own accord, and they're not paying for my time. But yet they are influenced and biased. I mean, there was quite a bit of payment in terms of in-kind support. This is my favorite cartoon. So industry is getting really smart. So it's not just physicians, but non-physicians. We're having increasing numbers of those middle care providers, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, who also are prescribers. And they are a very big group of individuals for pharmaceutical and medical device companies to start targeting. Policies on conflict of interest don't include non-physician providers. And so they've been exempt from a lot of the things that we've been working on. So they are a prime target. NPs and PAs are a very prime target. A lot of their educational credits are now being completely sponsored by industry. It's actually very, very concerning. Interestingly enough, nurses who might not be prescribers are the ones who coordinate care. So obviously, pharmaceutical companies want you to purchase to get the prescription the first time, but they want you to continue it. They have increased revenues by you keeping to take your medication. Well, who helps with that? Well, our nurses. Nurses help with coordination of care. They help with patient adherence. And of course, industry people know that. And they're also a target. So how are we managing these conflict of interest? We have two ways that we regulate: self-regulation and government regulation. Self-regulation, we have quite a few different ways that we've been doing it, and I'll touch on a few of these. There's a lot of professional organizations working on conflict of interest, such as mine, the American Medical Student Association, but there's quite a few others, including Georgetown University's Farmed Out program, the Pew Prescription Project, No Free Lunch. There's even a website where you can find out how much your physician takes from pharmaceutical and medical device companies, from ProPublica, Dollars for Docs. We do a lot of self-regulation in terms of accrediting councils. Our accrediting council, the Accrediting Council for Continuing Medical Education, has also tried to crack down. I mentioned that we're now from 46% of commercial support to 27%. But the problem here is, again, we don't know what that other is. The other income can include those companies that receive pharmaceutical support and then in turn are writing checks for CME. So we're not entirely sure if it's really trending down, which I hope it is, because that would be very positive, or it's just being put into another category. Additionally, as you might notice, the light blue, the advertising and exhibit hall percentages have gone up. Now, exhibit halls are chock full of swag and is a huge place for the industry to be marketing to physicians. And I have to say that even the US Senate Finance Committee that issued a report on this specific accrediting council in 2007 questioned whether or not the new regulations that we were self-imposing would even be taken seriously, because the ACCME actually can take up to 9 years between when a violation occurs and when the loss of accreditation occurs. So 9 years is a really long span, and even our US Senate Finance Committee doubts that it's going to be very functional. We are trying to regulate ourselves. We're limiting gifts, limiting how much educational support to $100. Again, though, this is not effective because it's not the amount of money of the gift. Pens matter. A pen will change my prescribing behavior just as much as a lunch. So that's not really as good. Disclosure. As you saw, I disclosed on my own today, but we're finding that disclosure is actually not being is not as good as we thought. Some of the new studies are actually saying that it is having paradoxical effects in two ways. Because I've disclosed, as a physician, because I've disclosed my conflict, that I now think you're going to think I'm biased, so I'm even going to exaggerate how good this drug is even more. And the other way they do it is, well, now that I've disclosed it to you, I can say whatever I want because it's on you. I have disclosed to you, I did my job, I'm done. And they're actually finding that we're actually being more biased in our conversations after disclosure. So I'm not saying not to disclose. I think it's very important. I think it's essential. I think it's a first step. I just don't think it's enough on its own. And we're finding in states like Vermont, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, where they do have mandatory disclosure laws, that it's not actually working the way we think. There's also organizations like mine that are putting together scorecards. We actually grade all academic medical centers on conflict of interest policies, which I think is really wonderful. What it's done is it's really highlighted good programs and really shown how poor programs are and what medical schools are poor in terms of conflict of interest policies. And studies have shown that conflict of interest policies, strong ones, are related to influence of practice. And so it's important for universities to have strong conflict of interest policies. So that's a pretty good way of self-regulating as well. We've had research changes, and some of these changes are very, very, very new. When Professor Melman asked me to speak a few months back, these changes hadn't even existed yet. So what we're talking about in terms of the adverse events, so now you actually have to submit the raw data so that a nonpartisan person can also look at the data to see if there's adverse events that you're not disclosing. That's good. The International Committee for Medical Journal Editors also has published brand new guidelines less than 6 months ago, I think it was in January, published new guidelines that said that all authors must be disclosed. This was to try to stop the ghostwriters from occurring. The problem is these are so new that we're not sure how well they're going to work. A lot of new critics are actually suggesting that there's quite a bit of loopholes in these policies that actually might make it even worse, in that now there will be permission to publish completely non-authored papers, an orphan paper. So more to come on those research changes, but at least we are making some strides in the right direction. So government regulation. So the Affordable Care Act has passed legislation, the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, because sunshine, as Justice Brandeis had once said, is the best disinfectant. And that's basically what we're talking about, is disclosure. Disclosing anything that's over $10 at one time, so that would include a lunch, it would not include a pen, or more than $100 per year. Now, there are exceptions to this. You never have to disclose samples, and medical students and residents are also not included in the disclosures. So this has not yet gone public. It is law. It is now compulsory. If physicians do not disclose this, they can be fined, and I've read some of the penalties can reach upwards of $1 million. So I think this is a very good first government regulation step. But again, as I mentioned, disclosure isn't everything. It's not the end-all, be-all solution. And there's loopholes. This also doesn't include other types of providers. So again, we're talking about the middle people who are not at all having to disclose. So what should we do? So briefly, I have 8 points, and then I'll open it up for questions. I think what we need to really focus in on is limiting and really, I think, actually removing sole industry-funded research. No fully industry-funded research. Perhaps we should think about compromises in terms of partially public, partially industry-funded as a compromise. No CME funding by industry. I think physicians, we need to be able to say we're going to have this continuing medical education with our colleague from across the street over a cup of coffee in our lounge. I don't think it needs to be fancy. Physicians need to not ask for payments of such high levels when they're doing speeches. $5,000 is a very large cost. I think we need no gifts at all. That includes pens. I think that we need to have insurance companies paying for second opinions. The more opinions a patient can have, the less biases that they will face, hopefully. We need to include other providers in the conflict of interest policies. We need to increase publicly funded research, not just through the NIH, but in other ways as well. We need to change the FDA standards for approval. No more non-inferiority trials. We need superiority trials. My patients' lives are at stake. My patients don't want to die because of a medication that they just didn't know was so unsafe, unless they have absolutely no other alternative. And we need to change the regulation on who can serve on the FDA committees. So in conclusion, conflicts exist. I think I have proven that. There has been progress, and I'm very pleased to see that progress has been occurring, and I think over the last 6 months it's been a tremendous amount of progress, but we are not there yet. We might be far from the days of the vacations in Hawaii, but we are still having a lot of problems in our medical education system, and we have a lot more to do. So I want to thank Professor Melman for inviting me, and the Case Western Reserve University School of Law for having me. And it looks like we have 10 minutes, if I can see that far, for questions and answers. Please use the microphones at the bottom of or will be brought to you. Or you have a question? No. Okay, questions.
Lately, as a practicing lawyer, I've been going back to read some of the books that I got in the 1970s when I was an undergrad. And one of them is by Wilson Bryan Key. And it's about advertising, and it's called Subliminal Seduction. And he describes in a whole lot of detail, with a lot of pictures, how advertising, and back then what they called computer optics engineers, would change pictures to put in these signals that would make people make decisions based on basically sexual ideas or sex drives. So I was reading that, and I was looking at, you mentioned the Viagra commercials, and there are other ones like that, and it is loaded with that. The whole idea of a pickup truck, and then it's towing something,
Right.
They're linking it, and then there's all these wet surfaces. There's at least 20 subliminal ideas in there. But is that also being used by the pharmaceutical industry on medical students through ads in medical student journals and things like that? Have they ever been reviewed to see?
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because actually medical journals actually accept, a lot of them, even the New England Journal and JAMA, accept advertisements from pharmaceutical industry. So they do have very similar advertisements. They are different in that they're not trying to market it to a patient. So the Viagra ones, for example, are very different in terms of it's not for you, the person, that you want to take this, but why you should prescribe it to your patients. And I'm sure that there are some sort of subliminal messages in that. The advertisement in general is a huge field, and there's a lot of psychosocial studies on it. And so it wouldn't surprise me. I just don't have any data to support that. So I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. I will say, though, that our journal, the journal that we publish at the American Medical Student Association, we are fully conflict of interest free. We don't accept any pharmaceutical or medical device industry money at all, including advertisements.
Well, Wilson Brian Key makes a point early in his book, and then the other author who was early in this field, about how the advertising industry has three main products that they try to push through advertising. And this is back in the 70s already, this: alcohol, drugs, and tobacco.
Right.
And they say that the massive margins in there, plus the massive amount of advertising cost compared to the cost of the product, makes them want to do anything to push that product.
Right.
And it's very critical of the nefarious effect it has on the human body, that people are being told, yes, overuse alcohol, overuse tobacco, use these drugs.
Right.
Maybe it was no dose at the time that wasn't strictly
Right.
regulated. And I'm wondering, has that really changed now that we have so many drugs on the market?
Well, now you're actually looking at drugs that are actually created for a medical disease like short eyelashes. Let's look at Latisse, for example. I mean, the medical disease of having, and there are some reasons perhaps to use it, but that's not who's actually being prescribed it. You can get it from a dermatologist. Latisse is to extend your eyelashes so that you have pretty long eyelashes that look fake. But again, we're marketing drugs that we don't actually know all the long-term side effects, actually. And Latisse is one of those, actually, that we don't know long-term side effects in terms of what does that do for cornea, corneal abrasions perhaps, and changing pigmentation of the eye. But we're starting to prescribe it for anybody who wants it because they want to have pretty eyelashes. I mean, that's just one example, and there are actual medical uses for it, and I'm not trying to downplay those, but it's that off-label using, which is technically illegal, and then pharmaceutical companies do actually have to end up paying fines. For example, Neurontin, the one that I was talking about, is an anti-epileptic, anti-seizure drug. It was marketed for migraines, and that's actually what it was started to be prescribed for migraines. That was never an FDA approval, and so that is why they had to settle for the $430 million, because it's illegal marketing. So absolutely illegal marketing absolutely takes place. They just don't all get caught. Other questions?
Two questions. First is Marcia Angel, the former editor of the New England Journal, wrote an article, Drug Companies and Doctors, A Story of Corruption. And I think in her article she talked about the amount of money that some of the medical school professors get from drug companies. And I don't know if we can talk about that. That's one question. The second question is totally different, and that has to do, CEO of a major Fortune 500 company said that doctors are trained, this is a medical school education thing, doctors are trained to go to the physician's desk reference and find a drug to give you that matches up with your symptoms. Then he says, that's stupid. They are not taught to look at the underlying cause. They're looking at symptoms.
So I'll take your first question first. In terms of Dr. Angel, you're absolutely correct. She wrote a book as well as several articles on this broken industry system. And it's a very well-known documented fact that there are medical educators getting upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars from pharmaceutical industry in terms of speaking engagements or for being a consultant on research, and absolutely that is taking place. The hope is that with the Sunshine Act, that because this disclosure will be now mandated, those things will have to be disclosed, as well as any research ties that you have with the pharmaceutical industry. But she's absolutely correct in stating that, and that's also, again, yet another bias. And that's why I always encourage students to look up their own faculty members on the ProPublica Dollars for Docs website. It's always very interesting what you'd see. And your second question was how physicians are trained. Physicians are trained in theory to look at as a patient holistically, not cookbook medicine as what's often referred to. And while there are symptoms and a list of symptoms that trigger certain things in our head to say what the diagnosis is and then perhaps the treatment options, I do think that part of the bias and the influence that we're getting is from the pharmaceutical companies saying, oh, well, these symptoms, I have a drug just for these symptoms. And I think there is some evidence to support that we might be moving from a system of purely evidence-based prescribing and from a system of really looking at what's causing the illness rather than treating the effects of an illness. Though it's hard to say. It's very individually based. And I think I had one other, I think we have time for one more question.
The legal industry, or lawyers, we all have a lot of rules on our own ethics, and we have to take continuing education credits for ethics, like every 2 years. Do doctors have the similar thing? And is this on the rate? Like, how big a movement is this?
Yes. So absolutely, physicians are required to take ethical courses. We take it throughout medical school. We also continue to take it throughout residency, fellowship, and in clinical practice. It is absolutely mandated, very similarly to how you take CLEs on ethics, we take CMEs. The problem still, though, is the idea of what is considered ethical. Right, so again, if you're disclosing that you are receiving this funding, you think that you've already now eliminated your biases and you're acting ethically. And it's not yet been determined that receiving funding from pharmaceutical companies is unethical. That's not been a policy by organizations saying it is unethical. Though some organizations, ours, but also the Society of General and Internal Medicine, for example, has actually released statements saying that receiving any sort of kickbacks or any sort of gifts whatsoever is considered unethical, and they therefore do not have exhibit halls. They therefore do not accept any type of funding whatsoever, because we do think it's unethical, but it's not considered, it's not yet a not every organization yet thinks that that's unethical, as long as you are still doing the things that are legal and that are still in terms of, like for the ACA, that you are actually disclosing and following what is required of us by law.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Please
you.
give a round of applause.
Thank you.
We wish you well.
Thank you very much.
On your residency.
And I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody has questions. I'll be here.